Inviting me, first of all. It's going to be hard to follow up on Alan's dynamic talk and sticking to the 30-minute limit as well. So let's get started. So I'm Manuel Pais. I'm independent IT organizational consultant. So I've had different roles throughout my career, about 20 years in the industry. And continuous delivery really changed my view of software and technology in general after I attended a workshop by Jez Humble and Sam Newman in 2011 about continuous delivery. So it was kind of mind-blowing. So that's when I started paying attention to continuous delivery almost 10 years ago. I'm also the co-author of the book, Team Topologies, with Matthew Skelton, who coincidentally was the original creator of this Meetup group of London City. So we wrote the book together. As we were doing consulting around DevOps and continuous delivery mostly, we often would come up with obstacles around teams. So Alan mentioned Conway's law. So we'd see that very often. And so we had a lot of discussions and patterns and about patterns, anti-patterns that we've tried and what we saw working and not. So this book is around how do we set up organizations for a fast flow and how do we set up organizations to be able to evolve much more quickly. So in line with what Alan Kelly was saying, this ability to discover much faster what is working, what isn't, and where should you spend your energy and focus. So, so the book was published by IT Revolution Press last year, which is also the home of DevOps Handbook, Finis Project, and other books like that, and Accelerate. So Conway's law, it's been around for 50 years. I'm not going to read the official definition. I quite like this one from Ruth Mallon, who is a senior architect. So 50 years later, she kind of translated to, if the architecture of the system and the architecture of the organization are at odds, the architecture of the organization wins, right? So the way we're setting up our teams and the interrelations between teams is what's gonna drive the architecture of our systems. And as we'll see, not just the design of the systems itself, but other aspects as well around continuous delivery. So I find that Conway's law has a strong effect on continuous delivery as well. And so Jez Humble has been warning us for years, if your architecture doesn't support continuous delivery, then you're going nowhere, or at least, it's going to make it all that much more difficult. Effectively, the architecture is going to be a strong blocker to fast flow if you have your monoliths, which might come in different shapes. So when you see something like this, you might have a monolith regardless if it's kind of at the actual technical architecture, or it's at build time that you need to build everything together, or you need to deploy everything together, or you need to test your microservices together for some reason, getting into this distributed monolith idea. And so whenever you have that, you're going to be much slower compared to what you were trying to achieve with continuous delivery. It's also going to make it much more difficult to diagnose problems and pinpoint what are the sources of these problems so that you can fix them quickly. So it's not just about delivering functionality quickly, but identifying issues and fixing them quickly as well. So in order to start kind of breaking monolith apart, regardless where it's located, you actually need to have these teams who are developing the systems to understand continuous delivery, understand architecture. You need the teams to actually take that ownership and in order to decouple both the system and the teams between them, so that each of them can deliver and discover more independently from the others. So that's a big part of team topologies. How do we have enough, the minimum structure, if you like, to allow teams to be independent without kind of getting overloaded with, just too much demand and too much skills that we're asking from them. so that we can, what we're trying to achieve is something like this kind of target where each team ideally is as independent as possible and can deliver value and can experiment and discover as quickly as possible. So part of that is being able to obviously have their own pipelines and their own process of getting those changes out independently. And so I won't go into a lot of detail about the topologies that we talk about in the book, but what you see here is streamlined team is effectively, you can compare that to kind of product team, similar to what Alan was saying earlier. So teams that have the sufficient skills to be able to discover where the value is and what do we need to do independently. So that's kind of a streamlined teams. We call them streams because you might have products that are too large and you have different streams within the product aligned to user personas or aligned to different parts that evolve at different pace. But anyway, you can look at streamline as product teams. So if you're in this kind of situation that we're looking here with this kind of monolith, these teams are probably going to need help around understanding what is really continuous delivery. What is the architecture practices and how can we change our system architecture to decouple these teams and decouple the different parts of the systems. And so probably an enabling team, which is typically a team of experts around some domain, can help there. So this enabling team is not going to do the work for the streamlined teams. They're going to help them gain the capabilities, understand the practices and also the tooling that's available, effectively reducing the learning curve for the streamlined teams around whatever domain they are lagging behind, whether that's technical architecture, continuous delivery, monitoring, whatever it might be. So an enabling team is going to facilitate knowledge, and this can be done through different ways. More traditional training, workshops, helping understand what are the tooling possibilities. But more importantly, this team is working together with the streamlined team. They're not in some kind of, ivory tower providing, just providing guidance without actually collaborating with the team. So they're pairing, they're mentoring, they're coaching. And so we're getting the experts in some domain to help the other teams in this kind of facilitation way. And so that can be quite, like I said, quite useful in this kind of early stages where you have big monolith, you have teams that are kind of low maturity in terms of continuous delivery and the good practices around it. But it kind of shows us that we need to think about CI/CD as more of a team-centric approach to make it sustainable. So focus less on the tools and actually understand the team aspects of continuous delivery. There was a really good article recently, a few months ago, maybe some people have seen it, from Forest, Brazil, where he was talking about Conway's law applied to CI/CD pipelines. So I quite like these drawings. I'm not going to explain everything. I recommend reading this article. But he's talking about the first one there, Cold War, is where you have all these silo teams, dev, QA, ops. So what you're going to expect to find in the pipeline is that you have all these approvals, these different teams kind of trying to ensure that whatever is going into production or into the customer's hands meets what they think for their discipline is the right criteria. The third one there, the blob, is also quite interesting because it's talking about if you have a kind of a central DevOps team, it doesn't mean that all the teams being kind of supported by that central team are going to be affected or helped in the same way. It depends a lot on the relationships between those teams. And you might have some teams that are further away from that central team and they might not actually get the same results as other teams. So again, I think this is quite interesting article to have a look and looking at different ways that Conway's law impacts continuous delivery. I kind of want to dig a bit deeper into this idea of centralized versus decentralized CI/CD and how it's kind of missing the point in a way. The saying goes, the devil lies in the details. So it depends how do you implement this, but you can find anti-patterns on both sides, right? So you can have centralized CI/CD. So let's say a team that is kind of responsible, or if you want to think about it as kind of traditional platform team. And so some of the anti-patterns that you might see include, they want to make upfront decisions on the requirements for continuous delivery for most of the teams and kind of standardize and kind of just then ask all the teams to follow the same way and the same practices, etc. This kind of one size fits all type of approach, because effectively that's going to reduce the effort on this centralized team. Is going to make it easier for them to kind of have this standard that applies and all the teams are using the same thing. And I'm not saying that's always a bad thing, but it's kind of imposing this kind of monolithic thinking around how do we have our continuous delivery set up, our pipelines, etc. Sometimes it leads to kind of monolithic tool chains where, again, we're just using a single tool set for everything. And sometimes it also leads to this kind of what the Jenkins creator called Jenkinsteins, where, we hang everything on this single instance or a few instances, and we're not actually understanding the different needs and loads from different teams using the tool set. And when we kind of start building more and more kind of homegrown tools, they tend to diverge, or at least make it more difficult to then support new emerging practices in the industry. As we find out, better ways to do things and to deliver our software, if we kind of build too much, it's going to make it a little stale and harder to actually evolve along with industry. And then when you look at decentralized CI/CD, so saying that, well, each team should own their own pipeline, should install their own tools that they need to do that and kind of have that autonomy. Yes, that's going to allow them to go faster sometimes, but that's the kind of the theory. But in practice, there are a lot of anti-patterns that tend to happen because this team often is already under pressure or not to develop the product or features, and they don't typically have enough time to invest in this. So you start seeing, in general, poor levels of kind of resilience of your deployment pipelines and all the tooling around it. It doesn't scale even within a team sometimes. When you have issues with the tools, typically everything stops. The whole pipeline holds to ground. So you have this large blast radius for problems. The tool chain is often, if you're using different tools that you've integrated in the team, then it's typically a bit fragile. And so that can cause frequent failures that are hard to diagnose. And again, typically they don't have a lot of time to invest in evolving the tooling and the practices. So, and sometimes kind of the idea that, well, CD is just having the pipeline, having the tool that supports the pipeline, right? And so we know that you need to actually invest in improving, understanding new practices, and having resilience and scalability, etc. So it's kind of a conundrum that neither of those is ideal, right? So it's more fine-grained than that. It's in general, the weak points or the anti-patterns in one approach are the strong points of the other approach. So what can we do about that? And so we need to actually think about that team-centric approach, is clarify what are the boundaries around the CI/CD and what are the responsibilities. And the thing is, this is going to change over time. This is what many organizations don't get it. And we often, as consultants, we're asked, implement a new tool chain that is going to be much better, and then we're done. And you're never done. Especially in large organizations, you have different teams coming from different starting points, different maturity. And if you want to provide a good CI/CD experience for those teams without overburdening them with all that kind of responsibility to do that by themselves, then you need to understand that this is going to evolve over time. You want to be able to evolve the responsibilities of the teams over time. So it's this kind of balance we're trying to achieve where, yes, we want to share good practices. and good tooling and make it more resilient, more scalable. So you, in general, centralized team will help with that. But you want those teams, those product teams or streamlined teams, as we call them, to remain, keep autonomy and ownership and be able to make the changes they need also in terms of their pipelines and their deployments, etc. So we really need kind of a different worldview, I would say, that accepts this reality that, those teams are continuously evolving as well. The product teams and the streamlined teams, their knowledge, their understanding of CI/CD is continuously evolving, and they might start from one point where they're more immature, and over time they're going to have more specific needs, and they're going to have a better understanding of the good practices around CI/CD. So again, the topologies, I think, can help us. So I mentioned enabling teams, and I'm going to talk about platform teams. So Alan, you said earlier that that's the worst thing. No, but I agree with you. So we're going to see what a modern platform team approach is, and that's definitely look at the platform as a product. And that's where, as Alan was saying before, where we see many times kind of roadblocks is looking at the platform as kind of a standardization, cost saving goals for this platform, and that typically doesn't provide the enablement and the acceleration of the product teams that we would expect. But before that, I have to introduce the idea of cognitive load. So the platform teams and effectively all the other topologies besides the stream teams are there to reduce cognitive load of streamlined teams. So cognitive load was defined by John Sweller as the total amount of mental effort being used in the working memory. So this is at the individual level, but we can think about it at the team level, right? Team cognitive load. And so very quickly, there are three different types of cognitive load: intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. You can kind of correlate them to, intrinsic are the skills that you need. So if I'm in a software delivery team, I need to know the programming languages that we use. So those kind of basic skills to do my work. Extraneous, you can kind of relate them to all the mechanisms around software delivery and operations as well. So how do I deploy this application? How do I build it? How do I test? How do I access test environments? Whatever it might be, all these things that might be taking up effort in our memory if we need to kind of think about them every time. And then germane is everything focused on the business domain. So the actual problems or the actual business initiatives that we're trying to validate so that we can get more value for the organization. So when you think about it like this, you can see that what we really want those product teams or the stream teams is to focus on the germane side. Spend most of their cognitive load as a team focusing on those business aspects. So we want to minimize the others. In particular, the extraneous cognitive load, is strongly related to the services that the modern platform can provide, and in particular around CI/CD as well. How do we reduce cognitive load on teams? By providing CI/CD as a platform or as a platform service. And so, again, this idea must start with thinking of the platform as an internal product. And yes, there should be product owners in the platform teams. They need to understand who their customers are, and they need to provide value, which might be a bit harder to measure, but the platform team should be looking at, also kind of as in a startup, look at the adoption rates, look at the user satisfaction of consuming this platform. Yes, our users are internal, but they're still our customers. And then you can measure the value of the platform by how you're able to accelerate the product teams and letting them focus more on the germane side of their work. So there's actually a very good definition that I find quite good for thinking about platforms, modern digital platforms, as a foundation of self-service APIs, tool service, but also knowledge and support arranged as a compelling internal product. So these last three words address that idea of it's an internal product and it needs to be compelling. It needs to show that it has value. So it should not be mandated upon other people to use the platform. Typically that's where things start to go wrong. But also importantly, the self-service pattern is critical. If it's not self-service, if the platform team is always going to be kind of in the way for the other teams to deliver whenever they need kind of some change that they need to go back to the platform team and ask them for help, we're slowing down the speed of delivery. We're slowing down the flow. So platform is actually a kind of ever-evolving curated experience for internal customers. That's how we like to describe it. Because there's more, obviously, than technology. It's also a lot about what is the experience. It's about thinking about our internal teams as customers and our internal engineers and other people as customers. And the fact that it's not something that's going to be, we just do it once and that's it. We're going to go away for 6 months or a year and come back with a perfect platform. That doesn't exist because the customers are changing all the time. And so part of this curated experience is providing adequate abstractions, kind of higher level abstractions. So for CI/CD in particular, it might start just with some templates for deployment pipelines and some shared practices and pipelines as code that the teams, the product teams can use. And this might be a good starting point, especially if teams are kind of immature around CI/CD, they don't have a lot of knowledge, or they're just thinking about pipelines as just build, test, deploy, and for them to start realizing there's much more to it, shift lefting, security aspects, for example, or introducing static analysis to discover certain types of problems, etc. And this might be good enough for a good while, but I like to use this quote or remember this quote from Continuous Delivery book around, the objective is to eliminate and to fail, actually release candidates as early as possible in the deployment pipeline. So we can get feedback on causes of failure to the team. And so if we think about that, this type of pipeline is actually going to take you, depends on why it failed, obviously, but in some cases it might take you quite long to diagnose where actually the problem is. So it might fail in some stage of the pipeline, but actually it's the tooling, the underneath tooling that's not available, or the infrastructure didn't scale, or whatever it might be. So there are many different ways that pipeline can fail. So it's actually not that good at some point to kind of have this quick delivery and quick diagnosis of problems. So what if we could have kind of higher level abstraction where these teams actually just need to specify a much more descriptive approach to the pipeline, where they say, well, what I want is that the pipeline fails whenever there's, obviously tests failing, or, I don't want to decrease the code, the coverage, or I don't want to decrease the code health, etc. Or I want to keep the, the build time under 10 minutes. So if it's longer than that, just fail the pipeline. So I know as soon as possible that, it's taking too long. We need to work on that. And so imagine you have this kind of abstraction where the teams are able to specify the criteria for the pipelines and get that feedback as quickly as possible. So rather than getting this, okay, your pipeline failed, now go and find out what the problem is. No, you specify this criteria and, we know exactly, or we have a much better idea where that failed. And so the other way to look at it is if the pipeline is green, it went all the way through. That means we are assuring that code health is as good as before. We didn't introduce vulnerabilities and new known vulnerabilities, build time, execution times under certain thresholds, if that's our criteria that we define for the pipeline. And so if one of these fails, we should get much better idea where that failed. Well, it failed in security test stage, but it was actually because the execution time went over 1 hour and we stopped the pipeline. So we addressed that problem. I know this is kind of extreme. Most organizations don't do this, but if you read about, if you look at what Dave Farley talks about as kind of 1 hour for executing a pipeline is kind of a healthy approach. But just to point out that when you start having this kind of higher level abstractions, this really helps the teams accelerate and be able to deliver and diagnose problems much faster. So effectively, you can look at it like this. So stream teams or development teams or whatever you call them in the organization, we want to reduce cognitive load around CI/CD. You know, you don't have to maintain, you don't have to be the owners of CI/CD tooling, infrastructure, etc. If you have a platform that provides those services in an easy to consume way and actually meets your needs. And that's how we can accelerate flow, because we're going to be reducing cognitive load on those teams. And, you know, it's not kind of ideal that we're going to hide 100% tooling in the platform. It doesn't mean that development teams doesn't know anything about what tooling we're using and how they work, but we reduce considerably what they need to worry about. That is the ideal for a modern platform. And so part of that, or another part of that curated experience is the actual thinking about the developer experience, right? So we think a lot about usability, hopefully, and UX for our external customers. Internally, we need to be thinking about the developer experience. You know, this might come in different shapes. You know, obviously, there's pipeline as code, and some teams might like that and want to use that, and you know, share good practices around pipeline as code between different teams. But other teams might prefer, you know, user interfaces to define the pipelines. You know, can we as a platform team actually provide a good developer experience for those teams, and perhaps support different preferences without also going overboard inside the platform. And by the way, this slide is not meant to be any equivalence between the different examples here. It's just a visual aid, but I had that comment one time. So it's just, you know, think about different ways in which your engineers would prefer to consume these platform services around CI/CD. And if we can support different preferences in a way that is not overburdening the platform team, then great. So there's actually a quite good example I like to mention from ABN AMRO, which is a bank in the Netherlands, where they're kind of, you know, similar to platform team. They support different tool chains for different teams. And, you know, the problem with the platforms when it starts to be kind of this unidirectional imposition that we create a service and now everyone must use it. And what you can see here with this example is much more of a give and take. So the platform or this kind of central team might accept to, yes, we're going to increase our own cognitive load because we have to support multiple tool chains to do similar things. But we're doing that because we're reducing the cognitive load on the product teams, our internal customers. We're offering them more familiar tooling, perhaps, or we're supporting more workflow options that they want to be able to use. Or it might be the other way around. We're saying, well, we need the product teams, the stream teams to take on more cognitive load of understanding a new tool set because, you know, this is gonna, you know, temporarily cost that product team more to do their, you know, their deployments, understand the platform services and tooling, but over time, it's gonna reduce cognitive load on the platform team. So it's much more of a conversational, evolutionary approach. And perhaps ABN AMRO at some point is gonna say, well, we're not gonna support Jenkins anymore because there's only 1 or 2 teams on that tool set. It's too much cognitive load for us to keep supporting that, or not. Or perhaps different teams still have different needs and different experience that they would like to have from the platform. So we're definitely considering developer experience. Also, other users of the CI/CD services, like, you know, operators, for example. If you have kind of this siloed, I shouldn't say it's not always siloed, but if you have a dedicated ops team, you know, perhaps they need to look at the pipelines to do, you know, diagnosing of problems in production, trace back, you know, code changes to the pipeline that, you know, deploy that change and back to source control, perhaps. You know, have you thought about what is the experience for those people? What do they need from the CI/CD services? So this is something that typically a modern platform team would look at. You know, whatever might be that's helpful to kind of track down incidents that the people with the ops role need to deal with. And this might be even inside the same product team. You might have ops and dev, or people having dev and ops role, but they are kind of you need to think about how they are, different, and what are different needs they have. Also, business users that we might have. We don't typically think about them in terms of CI/CD deployment pipelines. It's very much focused on technical aspects. But if we have this idea that actually there are different user personas, and we might have, product owners or business stakeholders, actually, they would benefit greatly from having information that is in deployment pipelines. It's just that the way that's presented is not consumable for them. You can't expect them to go and look at different pipelines and dig into the logs and find out, what was deployed or not. They're probably more interested in, what is ready, what are the features or changes are ready to deploy? Are they in production already under a feature toggle that I can switch on and off? How is this new feature being used already by our customers or not? All these things is what probably going to matter for them. And so you can think about and talk to them, understand what are kind of their goals and their frustrations, to hopefully include them as well in kind of the users of the CI/CD services. So for example, you might be able to generate some informative emails for these people that tells them, well, these features, these requests are completed, or these are still open, whatever it might be that helps them make decisions, right? So continuous delivery hopefully is, if you're not doing continuous deployment, but you're doing continuous delivery with feature toggles, and the changes are in production, but the business owners are going to activate them, then in which ways can the deployment pipelines and our CI/CD services help those people make those decisions? And then just applying this in general, what are the user personas that are going to consume this service from the platform? Understanding what they need, and how can we make that experience, again, this curated experience, better for them, which is in the end what's going to provide value by allowing them to decide faster, to deliver faster, to experiment faster, etc. So I mentioned the team topologies, but it's actually a lot around also the interactions between these teams. For being able to have that evolutionary approach that I mentioned, the fact that it's not a static view, where it's not an end state where say, yes, now we have the right services and we have the right teams, etc. Is, as we evolve, how are the interactions between those teams evolving? And these interaction modes are actually critical to evolve CI/CD as a platform service. So I'm going to try to go faster because I'm running behind. So it's effectively, you're going to need to be switching between strong collaboration between platform teams and streamline teams or product teams when you need new services or some evolution from an existing service. So this kind of collaboration pattern. But this should have an expected duration. It should have a very specific purpose. Why are we collaborating and for how long? Doesn't mean that it's always going to last exactly that duration, but we have an idea what is the expectation. And then other times, the platform team might be investing in increasing the support, increasing reliability, documentation for kind of stable services. So we call that X as a service interaction, where actually one team provides a service that the other is consuming. And it's easy to understand, reliable, etc. So these are very clearly defined interaction modes. It's not this kind of perpetual collaboration that we're expecting, or perpetual lack of collaboration in more kind of the traditional platforms that are just kind of mandating things to teams. So kind of general sort of pattern that you would expect for new services around CI/CD as well, but in general for platforms to have this collaboration initially between platform and product teams, discover what is the solution, if we're creating a new API, how it should look like, what are the use cases we need to support. And then over time, we go to get to this point where, well, we know enough, it's stable enough, we have the right documentation and examples and support to provide this as a service. And you should expect to collaborate with a few teams. So one of the things we see often is kind of premature X as a service, thinking we have something stable and we just, allow everyone can just use it. And in fact, different teams, as I said earlier, might be coming from different starting points, have different use cases. So you need to validate those and validate the abstractions for each new service with a few different teams. So expect that to happen. And so final slide, the final content is the hard problem about platforms are really having the right trust between the platform and other teams, and which are the internal customers, and this effective team interaction. So making that clear and growing those and focusing on those first before we're trying to just grow the platform, just add more and more services and everything. We're assuming everything is easy to understand, easy to use. And typically, the other teams might be having a lot of problems. They don't even report that. If we don't have right communication lines between platform and product teams, if we don't have open kind of feedback and actively asking for feedback, then we're probably going to miss when we're expecting services to be easy to understand and consume, when in fact they're not. And that's where I believe all the kind of problems with platform teams start from. So that's why we need to start with building that trust, building the team interactions, clarifying the team interactions first. So besides the book, we're working on a free workbook around remote teams specifically, team topologies applied to remote working, that should come out hopefully in August. We also have a set of training. So the one that's more related to this is around modern platforms, where you can think about what we talk about, CI/CD and platforms also apply to other areas, obviously. There are a number of resources related to things I talked in here today, where I go into more depth around things like treating your pipeline, your CI/CD service as a product, user personas, etc. for CI/CD. Sorry, I went over a little bit, but thanks everyone for listening. I hope that was useful.
Cool. Thank you very much, Manuel. And again,